The smell came first. It was not the smell of wood smoke, the kind that drifts from a chimney on a January evening and tells you that somewhere a family is warm. It was something else, something sweeter and older and wrong. It was the smell of paper that has been kept too long in a damp place, suddenly meeting fire. The man who smelled it first was named James Foster. He was the night watchman at the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C., and on the evening of January 10th, 1921, he had just begun his rounds. The hallways were empty. The clerks had gone home at 4. The radiators ticked in the cold. Foster was 54 years old, a former conductor on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and he had been a watchman for 9 years. He knew every smell that belonged in this building. This smell did not belong. He followed it. The corridor sloped downward toward the sub-basement, the way old federal buildings always do. A long, narrow descent lit by gas fixtures that had not yet been converted to electric. The walls were painted a pale institutional green, the color of every government corridor in every government city, the color that absorbs noise and light and human attention. Foster walked slowly. He carried a kerosene lantern, though the gas lamps still burned, because the basement was deeper than the gas lines reached. At the bottom of the stairs, the smell was no longer a question. It was a fact. He turned the corner into the lower vault corridor, and he saw the smoke. It was coming from beneath a door. The door was solid oak, 4 inches thick, with a brass plate that read, "Records Storage, Population Schedules, 1890. Foster set the lantern down on the stone floor. He pressed his palm flat against the wood. The wood was warm. He ran. Picture yourself standing in that corridor on the evening of January 10th, 1921. The gas lamps hiss above you. The stone floor is cold through your shoes. You can see the door at the end of the hall. Oak, brass-plated, ordinary. Behind that door are 62 million names. The smoke is curling out from beneath the door in slow, patient ribbons, the way water seeps from a cracked pipe. Nothing is rushing yet. The fire on the other side of that wood is taking its time. By the time the District of Columbia Fire Brigade arrived, the smoke had filled the corridor. The first hose was unrolled at 5:42 p.m., according to the official report filed 3 weeks later. The fire chief on duty, Captain Frank Wagner, would later testify that when his men forced the oak door, the heat struck them with such force that 2 firefighters were knocked backward into the corridor wall. Inside the vault, the bound volumes of the 1890 United States Census were burning. Not all at once, in rows, the way a library burns, when no one notices it for a long time. There were 10,458 volumes in that vault. Each volume was bound in pebbled brown leather, embossed with gold lettering. Each one weighed approximately 12 pounds. Stacked end to end, they would have stretched nearly half a mile. They contained the handwritten and tabulated records of every household in the United States as of June 1st, 1890. Every farmer, every coal miner, every immigrant who had passed through Castle Garden and Ellis Island, every black family in the South who had been counted for the first time in some cases as full citizens, every Native American on a reservation, every widow, every child, every name, 62,947,714 names. The water from the hoses turned the ink to black rivers. The rivers ran across the basement floor and pooled at the drain. By the time the fire was contained, just before midnight, the drain was choked with what looked, in the lantern light, like wet ash. It was not ash. It was the dissolved handwriting of 73,000 census enumerators, the men and women who had walked from porch to porch across America 30 years earlier, asking the questions and writing the answers down. The Secretary of Commerce was telephoned at home. He arrived at the building shortly after midnight. He stood in the corridor in his overcoat and looked through the open vault door. He did not go inside. According to the watchman's logbook, he stood there for 11 minutes, and then he asked for a list of who had keys to the vault. He was given the list. He folded it into his coat pocket. He went home. Imagine the smell in that corridor at 1 o'clock in the morning. The fire is out, but the air is thick. Wet leather. Burned leather. Wet paper. Burned paper. And underneath it all, something faintly chemical. The smell of the ink they used in 1890. An iron gall ink that turns black on contact with air, and that releases a particular, almost metallic odor when it burns. If you were to walk those stone floors today, the floors are clean. The walls have been repainted 4 times. But the building still stands, and on certain damp evenings, the men who work the night shift will tell you the basement still smells faintly of something they cannot quite place. The next morning, the newspapers ran the story on the inside pages. A small fire in a federal building. No injuries. Records damaged. The Washington Post gave it 3 paragraphs. The New York Times gave it 2. The cause was listed as unknown. A possible electrical fault. A possible cigarette dropped by a clerk. The investigation, the papers said, was ongoing. The investigation was never completed. 3 things happened in the weeks that followed, and each of them is documented, and none of them was reported at the time. The first thing was that a clerk named Margaret Voss, who had worked in the records division for 11 years, gave a written statement to her supervisor on January 14th, 1921. In her statement, she said that on 3 separate evenings in the week before the fire, January 3rd, January 5th, and January 7th, she had seen men in the lower vault corridor whom she did not recognize. They were not janitors. They were not watchmen. They wore suits, and they carried leather satchels, and they came after the clerks had gone home. She said one of them had asked her on the evening of January 5th whether she had a key to the population schedule vault. She said she had told him no, which was the truth. She said he had thanked her and walked away. Margaret Voss's statement was filed in the supervisor's office. By the end of February, it could not be located. We will return to Margaret Voss in a later chapter. She does not disappear. She is reassigned. The second thing was that the director of the census, Sam L. Rogers, wrote a memorandum to the Secretary of Commerce on January 17th, 1921, recommending that the surviving records, those damaged by water and smoke but still legible, be transferred immediately to a secure storage facility. He suggested the National Archives. There was no National Archives in 1921. The institution would not be founded for another 13 years. The records were instead moved, in February, to a warehouse on Pennsylvania Avenue. They would sit in that warehouse for 16 years. They would not be restored. They would not be copied. They would, in 1933, be destroyed by deliberate order of the United States government. The third thing was the smallest and the strangest and the most difficult to explain. In Baltimore, in a boarding house on Eutaw Street, an old man read about the fire in the morning paper. He was 78 years old. He lived alone in a single rented room on the 3rd floor. His landlady, a widow named Agnes Penrose, brought him his coffee at 7 each morning, and that morning of January 11th, 1921, she found him sitting at the small writing desk by the window, the Baltimore Sun folded open in front of him. He read the article slowly. He did not look up. When he had finished, he folded the paper in half, and then in half again, and he set it on the corner of the desk. He said one sentence. Mrs. Penrose remembered it for the rest of her life, because it was the longest thing he had said to her in 3 years, and because she did not understand it. She would not understand it until 1924, after he had died when his trunk was opened. His name was Elias Whitcomb. He had been, in the summer of 1890, a field enumerator for the United States Census. He had walked a stretch of country in western Maryland and recorded the names of approximately 4,200 souls. He had kept his original field notebooks in a trunk under his bed for 31 years. We will return to him in the final chapter. We will return to what he said. For now, picture yourself standing in the basement corridor on the morning of January 11th, 1921. The fire is 12 hours old. The vault door is open. Inside, the volumes that survived are stacked in wet, leaning columns, and the volumes that did not are a black sediment on the stone floor. The walls are streaked with soot in patterns that look, in the gaslight, like the grain of wood. The air is cold again, because the fire is out, and the heat has gone with it. In a few hours, men with notebooks will arrive to assess the damage. In a few weeks, men with crates will arrive to take what is left to a warehouse. In a few years, the warehouse will leak. In a few more years, the records will be ordered burned. But at this moment, just after dawn on January 11th, the basement is quiet. The names are still here, most of them. Damaged, soaked, smoke-stained. But here, 62 million people in pebbled brown leather, on stone floors, in a corridor that smells of iron and water, and something sweeter underneath. They will not be here for long. And the men who will decide what comes next are already, at this hour, in a room on the upper floor of the Commerce Building, with the door closed. They are deciding what to tell the country. What they decide will hold for 100 years. To understand what was lost in that basement, you have to go back 31 years. You have to walk out of the smoke and the stone corridors of Washington, and you have to stand in the dust of a country road in western Maryland in the first week of June 1890. The road is called the Old National Pike. It has been a road since before the Republic. It runs from Baltimore through the Allegheny foothills and onward into Ohio. And on this particular morning, it carries one government employee on foot, walking west, with a leather satchel over his shoulder and a government-issued pencil in his coat pocket. His name is Elias Whitcomb. He's 47 years old. He's a former schoolteacher from the town of Frostburg, where he taught reading and arithmetic to coal miners' children for 19 years before his eyes began to fail, and the ledger work became too fine for the lamplight in his classroom. He resigned in the spring of 1889, he took a small pension. In May of 1890, he saw a notice in the Cumberland Times that the federal government was hiring enumerators for the 11th Census of the United States. The pay was 4 cents per name in the countryside, 2 cents per name in the cities. Whitcomb, who had spent his life counting children in rows of desks, applied by post. He was one of 47,000. Picture yourself walking that road with him on the morning of June 2nd, 1890. The dust is fine and pale, and it settles on the cuffs of your trousers within the first quarter mile. The air smells of June grass and wood smoke from the distant farmhouses. You can hear, somewhere far off, the sound of a hammer striking iron, a blacksmith opening his forge for the morning's work. Whitcomb walks at the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has been a teacher all his life and has learned that everything important happens slowly. His leather satchel contains 4 blank ledger books, ruled in faint blue lines. His pencil is sharpened to a careful point. He has not yet written down a single name. By August, the pencil will be a stub. By December, the ledgers will be full. The 1890 census was, by every measure that mattered at the time, the most ambitious accounting any government in human history had ever attempted. The previous census, the 1880, had been counted by hand and tabulated by hand, and the work had taken nearly a decade. By the time the final volumes were published in 1888, the data they contained was 7 years out of date. The Census Office, struggling under a country that was growing too fast to count by pen and paper, turned to a young engineer named Herman Hollerith. Hollerith proposed a machine. The machine read holes punched into stiff paper cards. Each card represented one person. Each hole represented one fact about that person: age, sex, color, marital status, place of birth, occupation, whether the person was deaf, whether the person was blind, whether the person had served in the late war and on which side. The machine could process 80 cards per minute. It cut the tabulation time from 8 years to 1. It would, in time, become the foundation of the company that became International Business Machines. IBM. The corporation that built the modern world began as a punch card machine in the basement of the Commerce Building in 1890. But the punch cards were not the records. The records were the schedules. The schedules were what the enumerators wrote down by hand, on the porches and in the kitchens and at the doors of every household in the country. The schedules were the source. The cards were a translation. When the cards were tabulated and the totals were published, the cards themselves were destroyed because they were considered redundant. The schedules, the original handwritten record, were what was kept. The schedules were what burned. Whitcomb's first household, on the morning of June 2nd, 1890, was a farmhouse half a mile west of the Pike, set back from the road by a long lane of beech trees. The farmhouse belonged to a family named Mullen. The father, Cornelius Mullen, was 42 years old and had been born in County Mayo, Ireland. The mother, Bridget Mullen, was 39 and had been born in the same county. They had 9 children. The eldest was 16. The youngest was 4 months old and had not yet been named, because in that part of the country in that year, families did not name a child until they were reasonably certain the child would live. Whitcomb sat at the kitchen table. Bridget Mullen brought him coffee. He wrote down the names slowly, asking for each spelling twice. He noted the column for Civil War service. Cornelius Mullen had served in the 7th Maryland Volunteer Infantry Union from 1863 to 1865. He had been at Petersburg. He had a piece of grape shot still lodged in his left thigh, which he did not mention, but which his wife mentioned for him, because in the kitchen of a Maryland farmhouse in 1890, a woman did not let a stranger leave without knowing what her husband had given. Whitcomb wrote it down. He thanked them. He stepped back out into the June sunlight. He walked another 2 miles before noon to the next farm, where he counted a widow and her 3 grown sons. By dusk, he had counted 31 people. He stayed that night in a boarding house in the town of Grantsville. The boarding house cost 40 cents. His earnings for the day, at 4 cents per name, were $1.24. He would walk for 179 more days. Imagine the cumulative weight of those days. By the end of August, Whitcomb's boots have been resoled twice. The leather of his satchel has darkened from sweat at the strap. His ledger has filled, and a second ledger has been started, and the second has begun to fill. He has counted German farmers in the high pastures, black families in the hollows where the road becomes a footpath, an old man living alone in a 1-room cabin who has not spoken to another human being in 14 months and who weeps when Whitcomb asks him his name. He has counted a household where the mother is dying of consumption and the father is already dead. And he has written down the names of the 4 children who will, before the year is out, be parceled to relatives across 3 states. He has counted a Mennonite community that does not believe in being counted, and he has counted them anyway, because the law required it, and because they answered him politely when he asked. Each name is 2 pencil strokes for the surname, 2 for the given name, a small mark in the column for sex, a number in the column for age. Each name takes him perhaps 20 seconds to record. Multiply that by 4,200. That is roughly 23 hours of pencil work, spread across 180 days of walking. The walking is the labor. The names are the residue. The 1890 census counted 62,947,714 people. That figure is worth saying slowly, because no one says it slowly anymore. 62,947,714. Of those, 12.5 million were foreign-born: Irish, German, Italian, Polish, Russian, Chinese, Norwegian, Swedish, Bohemian, Slovak. They had arrived in a country that, for the first time in its history, was asking them to be counted not as cargo, and not as labor, but as residents, as people with names that the government would write down in pebbled brown leather and keep in a vault. Of those 62.9 million, 7.4 million were African Americans. They were the first generation born into freedom. Their parents and grandparents had been counted in the censuses before the Civil War as 3/5 of a person, or as property listed by initial only on slave schedules, or as nothing at all. The 1890 census was the first in which every black household in America was counted by full name, with full demographic information, with the same questions asked of them as were asked of every other citizen. For millions of those families, the 1890 census was the only federal document that ever recorded their existence. Of those 62.9 million, 248,000 were Native Americans counted on reservations. This was the first time the federal government had attempted a full count of the native population. The previous censuses had treated them as a separate foreign population, not part of the United States proper. The 1890 schedules included questions about tribal affiliation, about whether the resident lived in a traditional dwelling or a house, about whether the resident spoke English. The information was imperfect. The enumerators were sometimes hostile, but the names were written down. For tens of thousands of those native households, the 1890 schedule was the only federal document that ever named them as individuals rather than as a treaty. All of those names burned. If you were to walk into the National Archives today and ask to see the surviving 1890 census schedules, the archivist would bring you a single thin folder. Inside that folder are approximately 6,160 names. They are the fragments, pages from Alabama, from the District of Columbia, from Georgia, from Illinois, from Minnesota, from New Jersey, from New York, from North Carolina, from Ohio, from South Dakota, from Texas. Pages that happened to be in other parts of the building when the basement burned. Pages that happened to be in transit. Pages that, by accident of bureaucratic geography, were not in the vault on the night of January 10th, 1921. 6,160 names. Out of 62,947,714. That is one name preserved out of every 10,000 counted. The other 9,999 are gone. Not damaged, not partially recovered. Gone. The Mullen family of Western Maryland is gone. The widow with 3 grown sons is gone. The old man who wept when he was asked his name is gone. The Mennonite community, the dying mother, the 4 children who would be parceled out, gone. The 7.4 million African Americans counted in their first decade of full citizenship, gone. The 248,000 Native Americans named for the first time as individuals, gone. The 12.5 million immigrants who had crossed an ocean to be written down in pebbled brown leather, gone. There is no other source. The 1890 census was a single record. There were no copies. The original schedules and the bound volumes were the same documents. The enumerators wrote in the field notebooks. The field notebooks were sent to Washington, and clerks transcribed the data into the bound volumes that lived in the basement vault. After transcription, the field notebooks were considered worthless. They were not archived. They were, in the standard practice of the Census Office, returned to the enumerators with instructions to destroy them. 47,000 enumerators were instructed to destroy their notebooks in the winter of 1890 and 1891. Most of them did. A few of them did not. By 1921, of those 47,000 enumerators, only a few hundred were still alive. The work of the 1890 census had been done largely by men in their 40s and 50s, school teachers and county clerks and retired postmasters, and 31 years is a long time. By 1921, most of the enumerators were in cemeteries. A few were in nursing homes. A few were in boarding houses, in single rented rooms on 3rd floors, with trunks under their beds. Elias Whitcomb was one of those few. His 4 field notebooks, kept in defiance of his instructions, and of the standard practice of the Census Office, contained the only surviving primary record, written in the original enumerator's own hand on the day the names were spoken, of approximately 4,200 American lives, 4,200 names that he had written down with a sharpened pencil on porches and at kitchen tables between June and December of 1890, in a stretch of country in western Maryland that smelled of beech leaves and wood smoke and June grass. He did not know, on the morning of January 11th, 1921, when he folded the Baltimore Sun in half and set it on the corner of his writing desk, that those 4,200 names were now the only record left of the people who had given them. But he suspected. That was why he said what he said. Picture yourself in that boarding house room. The morning light is grey through the window. The radiator ticks. There is a brass bed with a thin blue coverlet, a wash basin on a stand, a single chair, a writing desk by the window, and under the bed, pushed against the wall, a small steamer trunk with brass clasps that have not been opened in 7 years. Whitcomb sits at the desk in his shirt sleeves. He folds the paper. He looks out the window at the brick wall of the building across the alley. He does not look at the trunk. He does not need to. He knows what is in it. He has known for 31 years. He says the sentence we will return to, and then he drinks his coffee, which has gone cold, and he begins his day, which will be a quiet one, like all of his days now. He has nowhere to go. He has no one to tell. The names in his trunk wait. The fire was extinguished by midnight on January 10th, 1921. The accounting of what had survived began at first light on January 11th, and it took 6 weeks. When the assessment was complete, the figures were these. Of the 10,458 bound volumes in the basement vault, approximately 25% had been destroyed outright, burned to a black sediment that the firefighters had hosed into the floor drain. Another 50% had been damaged by water and smoke, but were technically readable. The pages were warped. The ink had run in places. The leather bindings were swollen and split. But the names, in most cases, could still be made out by a careful reader holding the volume under good light. 25% had emerged untouched. That meant that in the first weeks of 1921, roughly 75% of the 1890 census still existed in some form. 47 million names, give or take, were still on paper. Damaged paper, in many cases. Smoke-stained paper, but paper. Congress was told, in a series of statements issued through the Department of Commerce, that the surviving records would be restored, transcribed onto fresh paper, and preserved. They were not restored. They were not transcribed. They were not preserved. What happened to them instead is the subject of this chapter, and it is the part of the story that historians find the hardest to explain, because it is not a story about a fire. A fire is an event. A fire happens in an evening, and it ends by midnight, and it leaves a smell in the corridor that fades within a year. What happened between 1921 and 1937 was not an event. It was an absence. It was 16 years in which a federal government with the resources to do anything chose to do nothing, and chose it deliberately, and chose it again and again and again every fiscal year, in budget after budget, until the choice became the policy. Picture yourself walking through the warehouse on Pennsylvania Avenue in the summer of 1925. The building is 3 stories of red brick, built in 1887 as a wholesale dry goods depot, repurposed by the federal government in 1919 to hold what the Bureau of the Census called non-current papers. It sits on the south side of the street, between a bakery and a printing shop, and from the outside you would not know it was a federal building at all. There is no flag. There is no sign. There is only a brass plate beside the door that reads US Department of Commerce. Storage Annex 4. The door is locked. The man with the key is sitting inside, on a wooden stool by the window, with a handkerchief over the lower half of his face. His name is Cornelius Hayes. He is 51 years old. He is a black veteran of the Spanish-American War, having served in the 9th Cavalry Regiment in Cuba in 1898. He came home with a partial loss of hearing in his left ear and a steady federal pension, and he took the warehouse position in 1920 because it paid $18 a week and required him only to walk the 3 floors once each morning, once each afternoon, and once each evening, and to file a weekly report on the condition of the contents. The contents, after February of 1921, included approximately 7,000 water-damaged volumes of the 1890 census. Imagine the warehouse in July. The Washington summer presses down on the brick walls and turns the upper floors into something close to a kiln. There is no ventilation system. The windows on the 3rd floor were painted shut in 1903 and have not been opened since. The skylight above the central staircase has been cracked since 1918, and pigeons have made nests in the rafters above it, and their droppings come down through the broken glass when the wind blows from the west. The smell on the 1st floor is sour, sweet, and constant. The smell on the 3rd floor is something older, something that has gone past sour and arrived at a kind of mineral stillness, the smell of paper that is no longer decaying because it has finished decaying, the smell of a thing that has settled into its long ruin. The volumes from the basement of the Commerce Building were stored on the 2nd floor in pine crates, stacked 4 crates high. The crates had been built in a hurry in February of 1921, and the pine was green when the carpenters used it. And by the summer of 1922, the crates had begun to warp. By the summer of 1925, several of them had split along the seams. The volumes inside had begun to lean. The ones at the bottom of the stacks had begun to take on the shape of the weight above them, the leather bindings flattening, the pages fusing. Cornelius Hayes filed a report on July 14th, 1925, requesting cedar chips for moisture control, new crates to replace the warped ones, and repair of the 3rd floor skylight. The report was acknowledged on July 22nd, 1925, by a junior clerk in the Department of Commerce. No further action was taken. Hayes filed 17 reports between 1922 and 1932. Every report listed the same 3 requests, in the same order, in the same handwriting. Every report was acknowledged. Every report was filed. None was acted upon. In 1933, when the destruction was ordered, the reports were among the documents cited as evidence that the records were beyond restoration. The argument was technically true. By 1933, much of the surviving 1890 census had decayed to a point where transcription would have required years of skilled labor and significant expense. The argument was also a kind of confession. The records had been allowed to decay. The decay had not been an accident. The decay was the result of 17 separate refusals to spend less than $2,000 on cedar chips, lumber, and a roof repair. If you were to walk into that warehouse in the summer of 1930, the heat would hit you first, the way it had hit Cornelius Hayes every summer for 10 years. Then the smell. You would walk up the wooden staircase to the second floor, and your footsteps would echo, because the building was almost empty. The government's other non-current papers had been moved out in 1928, transferred to a newer storage facility on M Street, and the 1890 census volumes had been left behind. You would see the crates. You would see the names on the spines in faded gold leaf. Population schedules, volume 412, Pennsylvania, Allegheny County. You would see the water stains rising up the walls in tide lines that marked every winter the roof had leaked. You would understand, standing there, that nothing in this room was being preserved. It was being stored until someone decided what to do with it. And someone had not yet been named. There is a woman in this part of the story whose name we have not finished saying. Margaret Voss had been 28 years old when she filed her statement on January 14th, 1921. She had worked in the records division of the Census Bureau for 11 years. She was unmarried. She lived in a boarding house on G Street, 4 blocks from the Commerce Building, and she walked to work every morning along the same route, past the same shops, with her hat pinned the same way her mother had taught her to pin it when she had first come to Washington from Wheeling, West Virginia, in the spring of 1909. After her statement was filed, 3 things happened to Margaret Voss in quick succession. In March of 1921, her supervisor was reassigned to a position in the Department of Agriculture. In May, the new supervisor informed Voss that her statement could not be located in the office files. In June, Voss was offered a clerical position in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in the Alaska Territorial Office in Juneau. The position came with a promotion in title and a small increase in salary. She was given 2 weeks to accept or decline. She accepted. She left Washington in the 3rd week of June, 1921. She took the train to Seattle and the steamship from Seattle to Juneau, and she arrived in Alaska on the 11th of July. She worked in the Juneau office for 3 years. In 1925, she resigned without giving a reason. She moved south to Tacoma, Washington, where she lived in a small wood-framed house on a quiet street, with a vegetable garden and a yellow cat named Theodore, and she did not return to Washington, D.C. for the rest of her life. In 1934, an investigative journalist named Walter Reinhardt, who was working on a series of articles about federal records destruction for the American Mercury magazine, traced Margaret Voss to her Tacoma address. He wrote her a letter. She wrote back. She agreed to speak to him in person, on the condition that her name not be used. Reinhardt traveled to Tacoma in the 1st week of September, 1934. He sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. He took notes in a leather memorandum book. He wrote down what she told him. What she told him was this: The men she had seen in the basement corridor on the evenings of January 3rd, 5th, and 7th, 1921, had not been carrying empty satchels. The satchels had been heavy. She had seen one of them set his satchel down on a stone bench in the corridor while he adjusted his coat, and the satchel had landed with the kind of solid, weighted thump that an empty leather bag does not make. She had assumed, at the time, that the men were carrying records into the vault, perhaps a late delivery of supplementary schedules. But after the fire, when she had time to think about it, she had realized that no supplementary schedules were due, and that the schedules in the vault had been complete and shelved since 1895. The men had been carrying records out. She did not know what they had taken. She did not know who they were. She did not know who had sent them. She knew only that on 3 evenings in the week before the fire, men with the keys to a federal records vault had removed materials from that vault in heavy leather satchels after hours, and that 1 week later the vault had burned, and the fire had destroyed any record of what had been in it on the night before the men had begun their visits. The fire, she told Reinhardt, had not been the beginning of the destruction. The fire had been the cover for destruction that had already started. Reinhardt wrote it all down. He left Tacoma on the morning of September 8th, 1934, and returned to New York. He spent the next 18 months attempting to corroborate Voss's account through other sources. He filed 3 Freedom of Information requests, though the act would not exist for another 30 years, and the requests were denied as informal. He interviewed 2 retired Census Bureau clerks, both of whom declined to be quoted. He attempted to obtain the original keyholder list, the list the Secretary of Commerce had folded into his coat pocket on the night of the fire, and was told it could not be located. His article was scheduled for publication in the spring 1936 issue of the American Mercury. In February of 1936, Walter Reinhardt contracted pneumonia. He died on March 14, 1936, in a hospital in Brooklyn, at the age of 41. His notes were boxed by his sister and stored in a basement in Queens. They were rediscovered in 1979 by a graduate student researching the history of the 1890 census, and they are currently held in the special collections of a university library in upstate New York. They are not classified. They are simply uncatalogued. They have been read in their entirety by perhaps a dozen people in the last 45 years. We do not know what was in the satchels. We will never know. We know only that Margaret Voss, who saw them, lived for 41 more years in her small, wood-framed house in Tacoma, with her vegetable garden and her yellow cat, and that she died in 1975 at the age of 82, and that she never spoke about the satchels to anyone else, and that when her house was cleared after her death, no papers relating to the Census Bureau were found among her possessions. She had taken nothing with her. She had only seen. Picture the country in the years that the warehouse sat on Pennsylvania Avenue with its broken skylight. The radio was in every home by 1925. The first transatlantic telephone call was made in 1927. Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic alone in May of that year. Talking pictures began to replace silent films in 1928. The stock market crashed in October of 1929. The Empire State Building opened in 1931. The country, in those 16 years, is moving faster than any country has ever moved. The most modern nation on earth is keeping the most complete record of its own people in a leaking warehouse on Pennsylvania Avenue, watched only by a man with a handkerchief over his mouth, while pigeons nest in the rafters above the second floor, and the leather bindings of 60 million names settle, slowly, into a shape they will never come out of. In the autumn of 1932, the acting director of the census, a man named William Lane Austin, ordered an inventory of the warehouse contents. The inventory was conducted in October. It listed the surviving 1890 schedules among a larger category of materials described as papers no longer of administrative value. In December, Austin submitted to Congress a list of papers recommended for disposal. The list was technical, and it ran to 47 pages, and it was reviewed by a subcommittee that met for 90 minutes on the afternoon of February 14th, 1933. On February 21st, 1933, Congress approved the list. The schedules of the 1890 United States Census were authorized for destruction. There was no debate on the floor. There was no public notice. There was no vote of objection. The authorization passed as part of a larger package of routine administrative measures in the final days of the Hoover administration, while the country was focused on the bank failures sweeping through the Midwest and the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt that would follow on March 4th. The men who signed the order were not, by any account, malicious men. They were administrators. They were responding to a memorandum that listed storage costs and decay assessments and the absence of public demand. They were doing what administrators do, which is to clear the desk of what no one is asking for. But the destruction would not be carried out for another year. There was a process. There were forms. The schedules had to be physically transferred from the warehouse to a federal incinerator. The transfer required a transport contract, and the contract required signatures, and the signatures required a fiscal year, and the fiscal year did not begin until July of 1933. The records, in those last months, sat in the warehouse exactly as they had sat for 16 years. Cornelius Hayes filed his last report on June 30th, 1933. The report listed the same 3 requests it had listed every quarter for a decade: cedar chips, new crates, repair of the skylight. The report was acknowledged on July 5th, 1933, by a junior clerk who would not have been born when the warehouse first received the records. By the time the acknowledgement reached Hayes's desk, the order to destroy the records had been on the books for 4 months, and the transport contract had been signed. Hayes was not informed. He learned in August when the trucks arrived. If you were to walk into that warehouse on the morning of August 14th, 1934, you would see the men loading the crates. There are 6 of them in workmen's clothes, and they have been hired by a private contractor on a federal transport order. They do not know what is in the crates. They have been told only that the contents are scheduled for disposal and that the destination is a furnace facility in Maryland. They work quickly because the day is hot and because they are paid by the load. By noon, the second floor is half empty. By the end of the week, the warehouse is empty entirely. Cornelius Hayes stood on the loading dock that week and watched. He filed no report about it. There was no longer anything to report on. The warehouse had been the subject of his reports, and the warehouse was now empty, and his job, by the 1st of September, was finished. He retired in October of 1934, at the age of 60. He moved to a small house in southern Maryland that he had inherited from an aunt. He grew tomatoes. He died in 1947. He did not, in his retirement, ever speak about the warehouse. His grandchildren, when they were interviewed in 2001 by a documentary researcher working on the history of federal records, said only that their grandfather had worked for the Census Bureau, and that he had not liked to talk about his job. They said he had told them once, when one of them had asked, that he had spent 14 years watching something rot, and that he had not been allowed to do anything about it, and that he did not wish to discuss it further. The grandchildren were not told what the something was. They learned, decades later, when they read the documentary researcher's published article. They learned in their 70s what their grandfather had watched. They told the researcher, in a follow-up letter, that they wished he had told them, because they would have liked to have known while he was alive that his quiet had been a kind of grief. The trucks went to Maryland. The furnaces were in a federal facility outside Suitland. The destruction took place over a period of approximately 11 months, between August of 1934 and July of 1935. And there is no surviving photograph of it, and there is no surviving log of which volumes were burned on which day. There is only the entry in the Bureau Ledger, dated July 17th, 1935, in a clerk's looped handwriting, disposed of per authorization. That is the entire record of the destruction of the 1890 United States Census. 5 words. Picture yourself standing on the loading dock of the warehouse on Pennsylvania Avenue on the afternoon of the last truck's departure, in late August of 1934. The sun is low. The brick walls of the warehouse are throwing a long shadow across the cobblestones. The truck is loaded. The driver is checking his manifest. Cornelius Hayes is standing in the doorway. Behind him, the empty interior of a building he has watched for 14 years. And in front of him, a wagon load of pebbled brown leather and water-stained pages, and the names of perhaps 40 million Americans on their way to Maryland, on their way to a furnace, on their way to nothing. He does not say anything. There is no one there to say it to. The truck pulls away. The names go with it. And somewhere, in a rented room on Eutaw Street in Baltimore, a trunk under a bed contains 4 leather-bound notebooks with brass clasps and the careful pencil handwriting of a man who walked a stretch of road in western Maryland in the summer of 1890, and the names of 4,200 souls who have not yet been entirely forgotten, because one old schoolteacher refused, 30 years before, to do what he had been told. He had been dead by August of 1934 for 10 years. The trunk is still under the bed. The destruction of the 1890 census is not a mystery in the way that a missing persons case is a mystery. It is not unsolved because the evidence is hidden. It is unsolved because the evidence is incomplete, and because the men who could have explained the gaps in the evidence chose over a span of 30 years not to explain them. And then they died, one by one, taking what they knew with them. What we have, instead of explanations, are the documents that survived. We have the inventory of October 1932. We have the disposal list of December 1932. We have the congressional authorization of February 21st, 1933. We have the transport contract, signed in July of 1933 by an assistant clerk in the General Services Office. We have the Bureau Ledger entry of July the 17th, 1935. 5 words in looped handwriting that closed the matter. What we do not have is a single document in any federal archive that explains why. The official answers taken together fill less than a page. The records were in poor condition. The storage costs were considered excessive. The public demand for the materials was assessed as low. These 3 reasons appear in 3 separate memoranda, all dated within a 6-week period in the autumn of 1932, and all written by men who had been in their current positions for less than 2 years. The reasons were technically true. The reasons were also, taken in any honest light, insufficient. Picture yourself standing in the records room of the National Archives on a cold morning in November of 2019. The room is well lit. The ceilings are high. The shelves are climate-controlled, kept at a constant 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 40% humidity. And the air smells faintly of paper and faintly of the recirculated breath of the building's ventilation system. You are looking at a wall of bound volumes, the 1880 census schedules, complete, every state, every territory, every county. The wall is 60 feet long and 13 feet high. There are 9,200 volumes on it. They have survived for 140 years. You can pull any one of them down and read the names. You walk to the next aisle. You see the 1900 census. Another wall, another 60 feet, another full count of a country. Between them, on a single shelf, sits a thin folder. That folder is 1890. That folder contains the names you can still find. You can hold it in one hand. It weighs less than a hardcover book. The wall on either side of it is empty. To understand what made the 1890 census worth destroying, you have to understand what was in it that was not in any other census, before or since. The 1890 schedules contained a single column that did not appear on any prior schedule and would not appear on any later one. It was column 24. The column asked whether the respondent was a survivor of the late war, the war between the states, and on which side the respondent had served. This question had been asked in a limited form on supplementary veteran schedules in earlier years. But the 1890 census was the first time, and the only time, that every household in America was asked this question as a routine matter, with the answers recorded in the same volumes as every other demographic fact, alongside the names and the ages and the places of birth and the occupations. The reason the question was asked is that in 1890, the federal pension system was the largest single domestic expenditure of the United States government. It was larger than the budget of the entire Department of the Interior. It was larger than the combined budgets of the State Department, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Agriculture. It was, in 1890, approaching 40% of all federal spending. The pension system paid benefits to Union veterans and to the widows and dependents of Union veterans. It did not, in 1890, pay benefits to Confederate veterans who were ineligible under federal law, and who were instead paid, where they were paid at all, by the individual states of the former Confederacy. The Pension Office, however, had a problem. It had no comprehensive list of veterans. The military records of the war had been incomplete, in many cases lost, in many cases destroyed when the War Department's archive had suffered a fire of its own in 1881. The Pension Office relied on individual claims, on regimental rosters where they survived, on affidavits from comrades, on the sworn testimony of the claimants themselves. The 1890 census, by asking every household whether it contained a veteran and on which side that veteran had served, would create, for the first and only time, a comprehensive baseline. A name-by-name federal record of every man in America who had claimed to have fought in the Civil War, and which uniform he had said he had worn in his own kitchen to a stranger with a pencil in the summer of 1890. That record was preserved in the basement of the Commerce Building from 1895 until 1921. That record was the record that burned. Imagine the political weight of that single column, 31 years after the schedules were filed. By 1921, the men who had been counted in 1890 as Union veterans were drawing federal pensions that, in many cases, had grown substantial. The pensions had been increased by Congress in 1907, in 1912, in 1918. A surviving Union veteran in 1921, if he had served honorably and could prove his service, could draw a pension of $72 a month. His widow, if he had died, could draw $40 a month. In a country where the average industrial wage was around $25 a week, these were significant sums. By 1921, the men who had been counted in 1890 as Confederate veterans were drawing nothing from the federal government. Their state pensions, where they existed, were small. The Confederate pension in Alabama in 1921 was approximately $25 a year. In Mississippi, it was $30. In Texas, $40. The difference between being remembered in column 24 as Union and being remembered as Confederate was, by 1921, the difference between a comfortable old age and a destitute one. It was the difference between a widow who could keep her house and a widow who could not. It was a difference that several thousand families, by 1921, had a strong financial interest in revising. Picture yourself in a county courthouse in eastern Tennessee in the summer of 1919. A man is filing an amended affidavit. He is 63 years old. He claims that his father, dead since 1903, served in the 14th Tennessee Cavalry Union from 1863 to the end of the war. He has documents. He has a comrade's affidavit, signed by a man in his 90s who can no longer write his own name and whose signature is a witnessed mark. He has a regimental roster page that he produces from a leather portfolio. He is applying for a dependent's pension on behalf of his elderly mother, who is 81 and bedridden. The clerk processes the application. The clerk has no way of checking it. The 14th Tennessee Cavalry's records are incomplete. The comrade's affidavit is the kind of document the pension office accepts every day. The roster page is genuine, or at least appears to be. The application was approved in 1920. The mother begins receiving $40 a month. She dies in 1923, and the son, who is by then her sole heir, receives a small lump sum settlement. What the son knows, and what the clerk does not know, and what the pension office has no way of discovering, is that the man's father was not in the 14th Tennessee Cavalry Union. The man's father was in a Confederate Home Guard unit that was disbanded in 1864 after a small skirmish near Knoxville. The man's father had spent the rest of his life telling neighbors that he had served on the Union side because the war in eastern Tennessee had divided families and divided counties, and made it easier, in the years after, to remember the war one way rather than another. The 1890 census schedule for that household, written down in the man's father's own kitchen, in the man's father's own voice, would have listed him as Confederate. It was the only document that would have listed him so. That document, in 1919, was sitting in the basement of the Commerce Building. In 1921, it burned. We are not, in this telling, accusing anyone of arson. We are not accusing anyone of conspiracy. The historical record does not support those accusations, and the historical record cannot be read backward into a verdict it did not pronounce. What we are doing is observing a coincidence. The records that vanished in the fire of January 1921 were the only federal records that could have settled, in tens of thousands of individual cases, the question of who had served on which side of the war that had ended 56 years earlier. In the years between 1921 and 1933, while the surviving fragments of those records sat in a leaking warehouse on Pennsylvania Avenue, the federal pension system continued to pay out benefits at a rate that exceeded in real dollars the entire cost of fighting the war itself. By 1933, when the destruction was authorized, the last large cohort of Civil War veterans was dying off, and the pension system was beginning to wind down, and the records that could have raised uncomfortable questions about how that money had been distributed were, by act of Congress, ordered to be burned. There is no document that says these things were connected. There is no document that says they were not. What there is, instead, is column 24, and the fact that column 24 no longer exists, and the fact that no one in the federal government, in the 84 years since the destruction was completed, has ever offered a public explanation for why the only column of its kind in American demographic history was destroyed before it could be transcribed. If you were to walk through the National Archives today and ask the senior archivist what she thinks happened to the 1890 census, she would tell you what she has been trained to tell you, which is that the records were lost in the 1921 fire, and that the surviving fragments were destroyed in the 1930s due to budgetary constraints and storage limitations. She would tell you this politely. She would tell you, if you pressed, that the matter has been investigated and that the official conclusions are well documented in the archive's published histories. If you were to ask her, off the record, in the corner of a quiet reading room, whether she thought the official conclusions told the whole story, she would not answer your question directly. She would instead tell you about a document. The document is held in the records of the General Accounting Office, declassified in 1979 as part of a routine review, and it is a memorandum from a junior auditor to his supervisor, dated November 8, 1932. The memorandum is one paragraph long. It states that the auditor has been asked to review the inventory list submitted by the Census Bureau in October of 1932, and that he has found certain entries in the list that do not match the corresponding entries in the warehouse manifest of February 1921. He notes specifically that the warehouse manifest of 1921 listed 4,712 volumes of damaged but readable schedules, and that the inventory of 1932 lists 3,847 volumes. He requests guidance on whether to flag the discrepancy. The memorandum is signed. There is no record of any reply. The discrepancy was not flagged. The inventory of 1932 became the basis for the disposal list of December 1932. The 865 missing volumes, the difference between the warehouse manifest and the final inventory, were neither accounted for in the destruction order nor included in the surviving fragments at the National Archives. 865 volumes, approximately 5 million names, vanished sometime between February 1921 and October 1932 from a federal warehouse on Pennsylvania Avenue, watched by a man with a handkerchief over his mouth, while 17 reports were filed and acknowledged and ignored. The senior archivist, if you press her, will tell you that the discrepancy is most likely the result of administrative error. Volumes were sometimes miscounted. Crates were sometimes broken in transit. Records in the early 20th century were not always inventoried with the precision modern archivists would expect. This explanation is plausible. It is, in fact, the explanation that appears in the published histories of the Census Bureau. It is also an explanation that does not require anyone to ask any further questions. Picture yourself in that reading room. The archivist has finished speaking. She is standing with her hands folded. Outside the window, a winter rain is falling on Pennsylvania Avenue, falling on the spot where the warehouse once stood, falling on the cobblestones that no longer exist, because the cobblestones have been replaced by asphalt, and the warehouse has been replaced by an office building, and the office building has, in its lobby, a small bronze plaque commemorating an entirely different historical event. You stand there with the archivist for a moment. Neither of you speaks. The rain on the window sounds like the sound of paper being turned, slowly, by someone who is being careful not to tear it. The destruction of the 1890 census reduced the most thoroughly counted generation of Americans to a population that the federal government, by its own action, can no longer name. The numerical scale of this is worth holding in the mind for a moment, the way you might hold a stone in your hand to feel its weight. 62,947,714 people were counted in 1890. Approximately 6,160 of their names survive in the federal record today. The ratio is one preserved name for every 10,223 names destroyed. Imagine a city of 62 million people. Imagine that the city has been entirely depopulated, every building emptied, every street cleared, every door closed for the last time. Imagine that on a single block of that city, in a single small apartment building, in a few rooms on one floor, 6,160 people remain. That is the proportion. That is the scale of what was preserved relative to what was lost. For the African American family in the hollow of western North Carolina, counted by name for the first time as full citizens, there is no surviving federal record of their existence in the decade between emancipation's second generation and the new century. The 1880 census recorded them as children. The 1900 census, when the surviving children had married and had children of their own, recorded the next generation. The decade in between, the decade of their adulthood, the decade in which they bought their first land, the decade in which they buried their parents, the decade in which they cast their first votes before those votes were taken away by the Jim Crow constitutions. That decade is a whole. For the immigrant family in the Lower East Side tenement, the family that had crossed an ocean in steerage and arrived in 1888 and was counted in 1890, with names still spelled in the Old World way before the names were Americanized in 1895. There is no surviving federal record of who they were before they became someone else. The 1900 census recorded the new spellings. The old spellings burned. For the Mennonite community in eastern Pennsylvania that had not wanted to be counted but had answered politely when the enumerator asked, there is no surviving federal record of the names they had given. The names they had given were the names they spoke at home, the names they used in their own meetings, the names that had crossed from the Palatinate in 1717 and had been kept generation by generation in family Bibles. The names burned. The Bibles in many of those families also did not survive the 20th century. For the native households on the reservations, counted as individuals for the first time, the names that had been written down in anglicized approximations by enumerators who did not always speak the language are now the names that no longer exist in any federal index. The reservation rolls of the Bureau of Indian Affairs contain some of these names. The 1890 schedules, which contained more of them, do not exist. The whole in the federal memory is not evenly distributed. It is deepest among the populations who had the fewest other records: the recently emancipated, the newly arrived, the never previously named. The 1890 census, which had been the first federal document to count them as people, was the only federal document that had counted them as people, and when it burned, they were uncounted again. They went back into the silence they had been brought out of. Picture yourself standing in the records room of the National Archives one last time. The 1880 schedules are on the wall to your left. The 1900 schedules are on the wall to your right. Between them, on the single shelf, the thin folder that holds 1890. You reach out. You touch the folder. The cardboard is smooth and cold. You pull it down. You open it. You see the surviving pages, water-stained, smoke-darkened at the edges, the handwriting of long dead enumerators in faded iron gall ink. You read a name. The name is a man named Joseph Fortin, of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, age 47, born in Quebec, occupation listed as cooper. He had a wife named Marie. He had 4 children. The youngest was 5. The page on which his name appears is one of the only pages from New York City that survived. There were 1.5 million people in Brooklyn in 1890. There are 43 names from Brooklyn in the surviving fragments. Joseph Fortin is one of them. He survived the fire because his page, on the night of January 10th, 1921, happened to be in a different bound volume from the rest of the New York City schedules. A volume that had been removed from the basement vault 3 weeks earlier for reference by a clerk working on a tabulation correction, and that had not yet been returned to the vault when the fire began. The volume was sitting on a desk on the 3rd floor. It survived because it was, on the night of the fire, in the wrong place. That is the scale of what determines who is remembered and who is not. A clerk's desk, a reference request, a piece of administrative chance on a winter evening in 1921 that decided whether Joseph Fortin would exist in the federal record and whether the families on the page next to his would not. The page next to his, in the original volume, would have contained approximately 50 additional names. Those names were in the basement when the fire started. Those names are now ash somewhere in the soil of Suitland, Maryland, where the federal furnaces stood, until they were decommissioned in 1962. The soil there has been built over. It is now a parking lot for a federal office building. The cars of clerks and analysts park every weekday on the ground where the names of 40 million Americans were burned. None of them know. In a boarding house on Eutaw Street in Baltimore, the trunk has been under the bed for 12 more years. The boarding house has changed hands twice since 1924. The new owner, a widow named Helen Crawley, has not opened the trunk because the trunk does not belong to her, and because she has been told by the previous owner that the trunk had belonged to a quiet old man who had died in 1924, and whose only living relative could not be located. Helen Crawley put the trunk in the attic of the boarding house in 1936, when she converted the 3rd floor into additional rented rooms. The trunk sits in the attic, behind a stack of old window frames and a broken sewing machine. The brass clasps are tarnishing slowly. The leather of the 4 notebooks inside is darkening at the edges. The handwriting of Elias Whitcomb, in the careful hand of a school teacher who had counted 4,200 Americans in the summer of 1890, waits in the dark. It will wait for 51 more years. It will wait until 1987, when the boarding house, then converted to apartments and owned by a family who has never heard of Helen Crawley, undergoes a renovation that requires the attic to be cleared. A young carpenter named David Asher will find the trunk. He will open it because he is curious. He will see the notebooks. He will not understand, at first, what they are. He will understand, eventually. He donated them in the spring of 1988 to the Maryland State Archives. The names inside, 4,200 names that should not still exist, will be made public for the first time in 98 years. Until then, they wait. The trunk in the attic. The names in the trunk. The schoolteacher's pencil work. In the dark, in a city that has forgotten him. We return now to the room where this story has been waiting since the first chapter. A boarding house on Eutaw Street in Baltimore. A single rented room on the 3rd floor. A brass bed with a thin blue coverlet. A wash basin on a stand. A writing desk by the window. And under the bed, pushed against the wall, a small steamer trunk with brass clasps that have not been opened in years. The man who lives in this room is named Elias Whitcomb. He is 78 years old. It is the morning of January 11th, 1921. The fire in the basement of the Commerce Building was extinguished at midnight, The newspapers arrived at the boarding house at 6. His landlady, Mrs. Agnes Penrose, has brought him his coffee at 7, the way she has brought it to him every morning for the 7 years he has been her tenant. She has set the cup on the corner of his writing desk. She has left without speaking, because Mr. Whitcomb does not, as a rule, speak in the mornings. He sits at the desk in his shirt sleeves. His coat is on the back of the chair. The radiator ticks. The window looks out onto the brick wall of the building across the alley, and the brick wall is wet with the slow January rain that has been falling since before dawn. He opens the Baltimore Sun. The story is on page 4, in 3 paragraphs, between an advertisement for a department store sale and a notice of a steamship arrival in the harbor. The headline reads, "Fire Damages Federal Records in Capital." He reads the article twice. The second time, he reads it more slowly than the first. The article does not mention the 1890 census by name. It mentions only that records of the Department of Commerce were damaged in a fire in the basement of a federal building, and that the cause of the fire was under investigation, and that the extent of the damage was not yet known. But Elias Whitcomb has been waiting for 31 years for a story with these specific details. He knows what is in that basement. He has known since 1895, when the volumes were shelved there, and the news had reached him through a former colleague's letter. He knows what burned. He folds the paper in half, and then in half again. He sets it on the corner of the desk, on the opposite side from the coffee. He looks out the window at the brick wall. Mrs. Penrose, who has been standing in the hallway because she has heard the rustle of the paper and is curious whether anything has changed in the small, unchanging routine of her quietest tenant, hears him say one sentence. She remembered the sentence for the rest of her life because she did not understand it, and because it was the longest thing he had said to her in 3 years. He said, "Then there is no one left who knows their names but me." He drank his coffee. The coffee had gone cold. He did not seem to notice. He did not say anything else for the rest of the day. Picture yourself standing in the hallway with Mrs. Penrose. The runner on the floor is faded green. The wallpaper is a small rose pattern, repeating, that has been on the walls since before she bought the house. You can hear the radiator ticking through the door. You can hear the rain on the alley window. You can hear, from somewhere downstairs, another tenant moving a chair. You cannot hear Mr. Whitcomb. He has gone quiet, the way he goes quiet most mornings. But this morning, the quiet is different. This morning it has a shape. You do not know why. Mrs. Penrose did not know why. She stood in the hallway for another moment. She went back down to the kitchen. She did not think about the sentence again until 1924, in the autumn, after Mr. Whitcomb had died, when the trunk was opened. He lived for 3 more years. He kept to his routine. He woke at 6. He had his coffee at 7. He walked, weather permitting, to the small park at the end of Eutaw Street, and he sat on a bench by the iron fence, and he watched the children walk to school. In the afternoons, he wrote letters that he did not send. They were found, after his death, in the bottom drawer of his writing desk, neatly stacked, addressed to people whose names were unfamiliar to Mrs. Penrose, and whose addresses she did not recognize. The letters were not opened by her, because she did not feel it was her right. They were sent, with the rest of his papers, to the boarding house's lawyer, who attempted to trace the addressees and reported, after 6 months of work, that none of the people named could be located. The lawyer returned the letters to Mrs. Penrose. She put them in the trunk with the notebooks, and the trunk went into the attic, and the letters were never read. The letters, when they were finally opened in 1988 by an archivist at the Maryland State Archives, turned out to be addressed to the families Whitcomb had counted in the summer of 1890. He had been writing to them decades after he had taken down their names, asking them whether they were still alive and whether their children were well. He had been writing to them at the addresses he had recorded in the field notebooks. The addresses, by 1921, were 31 years out of date. The families, in many cases, had moved. The houses, in many cases, were no longer standing. The names on the envelopes were the names of people who, by the time the letters were written, had largely been forgotten by everyone except the man who had counted them. There were 412 letters. He had been writing them slowly, over many years. The earliest was dated 1908. The latest was dated November of 1923, a few weeks before his death. They were all written in the same careful schoolteacher's hand. None of them were ever delivered. He died on the 14th of January, 1924, in his sleep. Mrs. Penrose found him when he did not come down for his coffee. He was fully dressed, in the suit he wore to the park, sitting in the chair by the window. The chair faced the brick wall of the building across the alley. There was no note. There was no last word. There was only the chair, and the man in the chair, and the trunk under the bed. He had no living relatives that anyone could find. The boarding house lawyer, after a search of 3 months that included advertisements in the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, and the Cumberland Times, was unable to locate a single person related to Elias Whitcomb by blood or by marriage. He had a sister who had died in 1897. He had a brother who had moved to California in 1882 and had not been heard from since 1894. He had no children because he had never married. Although a letter from 1889, found in the bottom drawer, suggested that he had once been engaged to a woman named Eliza Mary Carleton of Hagerstown, who had died of pneumonia in the spring of that year before the wedding could take place. Mrs. Penrose, who had not known about Eliza Mary Carleton, read the letter only once, and then put it back where she had found it, because some things, she felt, were not for her to know. Whitcomb's possessions were small: a pension from his teaching years, a bank account with $147.30 in it, the contents of his rented room, which included his writing desk, his clothes, his coffee cup, his shaving things, the bottom drawer of letters, and the trunk under the bed. The trunk had been bequeathed in his will to the family who runs the house at this address, in trust, with the request that its contents be preserved as long as practicable, and that they not be destroyed. The will did not explain what was in the trunk. Mrs. Penrose opened it on the afternoon of the 14th of January, 1924, the day he was found, in the presence of the lawyer. They lifted the lid together. Inside were 4 leather-bound notebooks. The leather was a dark brown, almost black with age. The brass clasps were tarnished. The notebooks were stacked neatly, 2 and 2, with a piece of folded brown paper between them as protection. There was a sealed envelope on top, addressed in Whitcomb's hand to the finder, whoever that may be. Mrs. Penrose opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief. It was 4 sentences long. It said, "These are the original field notebooks of my work as an enumerator for the 11th Census of the United States, taken in the summer and autumn of 1890. They are the only surviving record, in the original handwriting, of the 4,200 persons whose names they contain. I was instructed in the winter of 1890 to destroy them. I did not. I beg of you, whoever finds them, to let them be." It was signed, in the same hand, Elias H. Whitcomb, formerly of Frostburg, Maryland. There was no other instruction. Mrs. Penrose closed the trunk. She had the lawyer carry it to the attic that afternoon. She placed it in the back of the attic, behind a stack of old window frames and a broken sewing machine. She covered it with a piece of canvas. She did not open it again for the rest of her life. She died in 1947 of heart failure at the age of 73. The boarding house was sold to a younger family in 1948. The new owners did not go up to the attic because they had no need to. The trunk sat in the dark, behind the window frames and the sewing machine, for 40 more years. If you were to walk into that attic on a summer afternoon in 1965, the heat would press down through the roof beams. The air would be still and thick with the smell of old wood and dust. You would see the canvas-covered shape in the back corner. You would not know what it was. You would walk past it. You would close the attic door behind you. You would go back down to the rooms below, where families were living, where children were doing their homework at kitchen tables, where the radio was playing a song from a year that the man in the trunk had never heard of. The names in the trunk would be 80 years old. They would still be waiting. The trunk was found on the 4th of April, 1987, by a young carpenter named David Asher, who was 26 years old and who had been hired by the building's then owners to convert the attic into a finished living space. He was clearing the back corner. He moved the broken sewing machine. He pulled the canvas off the trunk. He stood looking at it for a moment in the bare light of a single bulb that he had hung from a roof beam. He had found old things in attics before. He had found, in a previous job, a box of 19th century newspapers, and a violin without strings, and a child's dollhouse with the furniture still inside. He thought, looking at the trunk, that it was probably more of the same. He decided to open it. The clasps were tarnished but not rusted. They opened with a small effort. He lifted the lid. He saw the 4 leather notebooks. He saw the envelope on top, addressed in faded ink to the finder, whoever that may be. He stood for a long moment in the attic with the lid open. He read the letter. He read it twice. He put the letter back in the envelope. He closed the trunk. He went downstairs and called the building's owners and told them what he had found. The owners, a couple in their 40s who had purchased the building in 1981, came up to the attic that evening with him. They read the letter. They sat on the attic floor in the dust and the bare bulb light, and they did not know what to do. The wife, whose name was Sarah, was a high school history teacher. She knew what the 1890 census was. She knew what had happened to it. She knew, sitting in that attic, that what was in the trunk should not exist. The notebooks were authenticated by the Maryland State Archives over a period of 6 months in 1988. The handwriting was matched against the few surviving samples of Elias Whitcomb's signature in pension records and in his teaching contracts from the Frostburg School District. The paper of the notebooks was tested and dated to the late 1880s, consistent with the standard issue paper used by the Census Bureau in 1890. The ink was iron gall ink of the period. The brass clasps were of a manufacture consistent with American leatherwork of the 1880s. Every detail was consistent. Nothing was inconsistent. The notebooks were what they claimed to be. They contained 4,217 names. They contained the demographic data for those names: age, sex, color, marital status, place of birth, occupation, and the column 24 entry for Civil War service, complete with regiment and side for every veteran in the household. They contained, in Whitcomb's marginal notations, the small symbols he had made: a circle for households with children, a cross for households where someone had recently died, a dash for houses that had been abandoned, but where the neighbors still remembered who had lived there. They contained, in the rear pages of the 4th notebook, a list of every household he had been unable to count, the families who had been away, the cabins he had found empty, the addresses where the door had not been opened. He had returned to those addresses, in some cases 3 and 4 times. The marginal dates showed when each return had been made. He had not skipped a single household. He had simply marked them as uncounted, and he had gone back, and he had counted them when he could. In the front of the 1st notebook, in pencil, in a hand that was younger than the hand that had written the letter in 1924, was an inscription. It read, "Begun this 2nd day of June, 1890, on the Old National Pike, west of Cumberland, in the service of the United States. May the names herein be remembered." He was 47 years old when he wrote that. He could not have known, when he wrote it, that the names herein would, in the end, only be remembered because he had refused to do what he had been told. The notebooks are held today in the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, in a climate-controlled vault. They are not on public display. They can be viewed by appointment, by genealogical researchers and historians, and they have been viewed by approximately 300 people in the 37 years since they were donated. Every once in a while, a researcher will find, in the pages, an ancestor that no other federal record has preserved. There is a family in Pittsburgh whose great-great-grandfather appears only in Whitcomb's notebook and in no other surviving document. There is a family in Cumberland whose entire household, 6 people, including a child who lived only to the age of 3, exists in the federal record nowhere except on page 63 of the 2nd notebook. The child's name was Ada Margaret Hess. She was born in February of 1887, and she died in October of 1893. Without Whitcomb's notebook, the federal government would have no record that she ever lived. 4,217 names out of 62,947,714. It is an impossibly small fraction. It is 1 name out of every 14,928 that were counted. It is, in the larger arithmetic of what was lost, almost nothing. It is also, in its own way, almost everything, because it is the only piece of the 1890 census that exists in the original enumerator's hand, on the original paper, in the original ink, written down in the kitchen or on the porch of the family whose name it preserves. The fragments at the National Archives are Clark's transcriptions, copies of copies, made in Washington in the years after 1890. They are records. Whitcomb's notebooks are something different. They are a presence. They are the only place in the entire surviving documentary record of the 1890 census where you can hold in your hand the same paper as that was in the room when the names were spoken. Imagine yourself in that attic in 1987. The dust on the trunk is half an inch thick. You open it. You see the notebooks. You take one out. You open it. You see the handwriting of a man who has been dead for 63 years, recording the names of people who have been dead for over a century. You read the first name on the first page. The first name is Cornelius Mullen, age 42, born County Mayo, Ireland, occupation farmer, served 7th Maryland Volunteer Infantry, Union, 1863 to 1865. And for a moment, just for a moment, while your eye is on the page and your mind is making the small accommodation that the act of reading always requires, Cornelius Mullen, who has been dead since 1907, exists again. He is in the room with you. He is 42 years old. He has just answered the door on a June morning in 1890. He has just told a stranger his name. You close the notebook. He goes back to where he has been. But for a moment, he was here. That is what the notebook does. That is what every name in the notebook does when someone reads it. That is what every name in every record does when the record survives. The names that did not survive cannot do this anymore. The 7.4 million African Americans who were counted in 1890 cannot do this anymore. The 12.5 million immigrants cannot do this anymore. The 248,000 Native Americans cannot do this anymore. The 40 million unnamed Americans whose pages were on Pennsylvania Avenue and were trucked to Suitland in the summer of 1934 cannot do this anymore. They cannot be made to exist again, even for a moment, because the paper that named them is no longer paper. It is soil under a parking lot in Maryland. It is ash mixed with the rain that fell on Suitland between 1934 and 1962, mixed with the runoff into the Anacostia River, mixed with everything that has been mixed with it since. They are not lost. They are not forgotten. They are erased, which is a different thing. The 4,217 in Whitcomb's notebooks are the exception. The exception exists because one schoolteacher, in the winter of 1890, when he was instructed to destroy his notebooks, did not destroy them. He put them in a trunk. He carried the trunk with him, from Frostburg to Cumberland, from Cumberland to Hagerstown, from Hagerstown to Baltimore, through every move of the next 34 years of his life. He kept the trunk under his bed. He did not open it often. He did not show it to anyone. When he died, he left it to a stranger, with a letter asking only that it be preserved as long as practicable, and that it not be destroyed. It was preserved. By a landlady who put it in an attic. By a series of building owners who never went up to look. By a young carpenter who decided, on a spring afternoon, in 1987, to open the canvas-covered shape in the back corner of the room he was renovating. It was preserved by accident, by inheritance, by the small carelessness of people who did not throw things away. It was preserved because Elias Whitcomb, on a December afternoon in 1890, did one quiet act of disobedience. He folded 4 notebooks into a leather trunk. He closed the lid. He carried the trunk home. He did not know, when he did this, that he was preserving the only primary record of 4,217 American lives. He suspected, on a January morning in 1921, when he folded a newspaper in half and said one sentence to a landlady who did not understand it, that the suspicion had become a fact. By then it was too late to do anything but wait. So he waited. For 3 more years, in a quiet room on Eutaw Street, he waited. He drank his coffee in the mornings. He walked to the park in the afternoons. He wrote letters to the dead. He kept the trunk under his bed. When he could no longer wait, he died. The trunk waited for him. Where are they now? The 62,947,714. Their bones are in cemeteries across the country, in graves that, in many cases, no one visits anymore. Their photographs, where photographs were ever taken, are in shoeboxes, in attics, in the drawers of dresses that were given to estate sales by grandchildren who did not know who the people in the photographs were. Their names are scattered across the records that did survive, in church registers, in city directories, in immigration manifests, in the marriage licenses of the counties where they were married, in the death certificates of the counties where they died. Some of them are still findable, with patient work, by descendants who care enough to look. Some of them are not findable by anyone. The 1890 census, which had counted them all, can no longer help them be found. The 1890 census, which had been the first federal document to include the recently emancipated, the newly arrived, and the never previously named, cannot now be consulted on their behalf. The 1890 census, which had been the most complete record of a generation, is today a thin folder in the National Archives and 4 leather notebooks in a vault in Annapolis. 6,160 names in the federal collection. 4,217 names in the Whitcomb notebooks. 10,377 names total. That is the surviving inheritance. That is what is left of a generation that had numbered nearly 63 million. The ratio is not worth calculating. The ratio is too small to mean anything. What is worth holding, instead, is the smallest unit of the loss. One name, one person, one household, on one porch, on a June afternoon in 1890. The man at the door, who had never had his name written down by anyone before. The woman in the kitchen, who said her children's names slowly, twice to be sure. The child in the doorway, whose name was Ada Margaret Hess, who would die in October of 1893, 6 years before her 7th birthday, and whose existence in the federal record depends entirely on the fact that an old schoolteacher in a boarding house in Baltimore did not, when he was told to, destroy a notebook. Multiply that one name by the number of names that did not survive. Hold the multiplication in the mind for a moment. Then let it go, because the mind cannot hold it. Picture yourself standing in the reading room of the Maryland State Archives on a quiet weekday afternoon. The archivist has brought you the first notebook. She has set it on a foam cradle on the reading table. She has put on white cotton gloves and helped you put on a pair as well. She has opened the cover. She has shown you, on the inside of the front board, the inscription in pencil. Begun this 2nd day of June, 1890, on the old National Pike, west of Cumberland, in the service of the United States. May the names herein be remembered. She has stepped back. She has left you alone, with the notebook. You turn the first page. You read the first name. You hear, faintly, the sound of a porch door opening on a June morning in 1890. You hear a man telling a stranger his name. You hear a stranger writing the name down. You close the notebook eventually. You give it back. You walk out of the building into the afternoon. The names go back into the vault. But for a moment, while you read them, they were here. And somewhere, in the silence of that vault, in the silence of the basement that burned in 1921, in the silence of the warehouse that leaked for 16 years, in the silence of the furnaces in Switzerland that ran for 11 months between 1934 and 1935, in the silence of the boarding house room on Eutaw Street, where an old man folded a newspaper in half and said one sentence and then said nothing else for 3 more years. Somewhere in all that silence, a generation is still waiting to be counted. Most of them will wait forever. The Federal Record cannot find them. The Federal Record, by its own action, has erased them. A few of them, 4,217 of them, are not waiting anymore. They were preserved by one man's quiet refusal in the winter of 1890, by one landlady's discretion in 1924, by one carpenter's curiosity in 1987. The rest are gone. They are not haunted. They are not lost. They are not forgotten in the way that we usually mean when we use that word. They are erased by a fire that no one ever took responsibility for, and by a signature on a winter afternoon in Washington, and by 16 years of small refusals to spend $2,000 on cedar chips and a roof repair. The 1890 census did not vanish. It disappeared. And the question that remains, after 135 years, is the question that has no answer, because the answer was burned, and what was not burned was thrown away, and what was not thrown away was forgotten in an attic for 63 years, until a young carpenter happened to look behind a sewing machine on a spring afternoon. Where are they now? Does anyone remember their names? Somewhere in a vault in Annapolis, 4 leather notebooks remember 4,217 of them. Somewhere in a thin folder in the National Archives, the Federal Record remembers 6,160 more. Somewhere in family Bibles, in church registers, in the soft echo of a name passed down through 5 generations to a great-great-grandchild who does not know where the name came from, a few more are remembered. The rest are silent. The silence is the size of a country. The silence is 62,947,714 names. Minus of those, the 10,377 that survived. Minus of those, the few 100,000 who are remembered, dimly, in the records that were not federal and were not centralized, and were not in the basement of the Commerce Building on the night of January 10th, 1921. The silence is what is left. The silence is most of them. And on a quiet evening, if you were to walk through the streets of any old American city, if you were to stand in the doorway of any old building, if you were to look up at the windows of the rooms where people once lived, the silence would be there. It would not announce itself. It would not feel like anything in particular. It would feel only like the ordinary quiet of an ordinary evening, in an ordinary city, in a country that had once counted everyone, and that had then, by carelessness, and by signature, and by 16 years of small refusals, allowed the count to disappear. The silence is the count, gone back into the dark. The silence is 62 million people waiting for a name they will not be given again.